Carlos was just getting out of the shower when the phone rang. He wrapped a towel around his waist and stumbled out into the cramped living room, nearly tripping over a still unopened box of books in his haste to get to the bleating phone. He hadn't had time to get an answering machine since moving to the city, and only the new field office had his number. It wouldn't pay to miss any calls, particularly since Umbrella was footing his bills. He snatched up the receiver with one dripping hand and tried not to sound too out of breath. "Hello? Carlos, it's Mitch Harami." Unconsciously, Carlos stood up a little straighter, still clutching the damp towel. "Yes, sir." Harami was his squad leader. Carlos had only met him twice, not enough time to get a solid read on him, but he seemed competent enough, as did the other guys in the squad. Competent, if not exactly up front. Like Carlos, no one talked much about their past, although he knew for a fact that Harami had been involved in a gun running through South America a few years back before he'd started to work for Umbrella. It seemed that everyone he'd met on the UBCS had a secret or two, most of them involving activities not strictly legal. "Orders just came down on a developing situation. We're calling everyone in on this ASAP. You got an hour to report, and we leave in 2. That's 1,500 hours, comprende?" "Si. Yes, sir." Carlos had been fluent in English for years, but he was still getting used to speaking it full time. Is there any info on what kind of situation? Negative. You'll be briefed along with the rest of us when you come in." Harami's tone of voice suggested that he had more to say. Carlos waited, starting to feel chilled by the water drying on his body. "Word is, it's a chemical spill," Harami said, and Carlos thought he would hear a thread of unease in the squad leader's voice. "Something that's making them act differently." Carlos frowned. "Differently how?" Harami sighed. "They don't pay us to ask questions, Oliveira, do they? Now they know as much as I do. Just get here." "Yes, sir," Carlos said, but Harami had already hung up. Carlos dropped the receiver into his cradle, not sure if he should feel excited or nervous about his first UBCS operation. Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, an impressive title for a group of hired ex-mercenaries and ex-military, most with combat experience and shady backgrounds. The recruiter in Honduras had said that they'd be called upon to deal with the situations that Umbrella needed handled quickly and aggressively, and legally. After 3 years of fighting in private little wars between rival gangs and revolutionaries, of living in mud shacks and eating out of cans, the promise of real employment, and at an astonishingly good wage, was like an answered prayer. Too good to be true, that's what I thought. And what if it turns out that I was right? Carlos shook his head. He wasn't going to find out standing around in a towel. In any case, it couldn't possibly be worse than shooting it out with a bunch of coked-up pendejos in some anonymous jungle, wondering if he'd hear the bullet that finally took him out. He had an hour, and it was a 20-minute walk to the office. He turned toward the bedroom, suddenly determined to show up early, to see if he could get any more out of Harami about what was going on. Already he could feel the warm build of nervous adrenaline in his gut. A feeling he'd grown up with and knew better than any other. Part anticipation, part excitement, and a healthy dose of fear. Carlos grinned as he finished toweling off, amused at himself. He'd spent too much time in the jungle. He was in the United States now, working for a legitimate pharmaceutical company. What was there to be afraid of? Nada, he said, and still smiling, he went to find his fatigues. Late September in the outskirts of the big city. It was a sunny day, but Carlos could feel the first whisper of autumn as he hurried toward the field office. A kind of thinning of the air, leaves beginning to wilt on the branches overhead. Not that there were very many trees. His apartment was at the edge of a sprawling industrial area. A few dingy fabrication plants, fenced lots overgrown with weeds, seeming acres of run-down storage facilities. The UBCS office was actually a renovated warehouse on an umbrella-owned lot, surrounded by a fairly modern shipping complex, complete with helipad and loading docks. A nice setup, although Carlos wondered again why they decided to build in such a crummy area. They could obviously afford much better. Carlos checked his watch as he headed up Everett Street and started to walk a little faster. He wasn't going to be late, but he still wanted to get there before the briefing. See what the other guys were saying. Hirami had said they were calling in everyone. 4 platoons, 3 squads of 10 in each platoon. 120 people all total. Carlos was a corporal in Squad A of Platoon D. Ridiculous how these things were set up, but he supposed it was necessary to keep track of everyone. Somebody had to know something. He took a right where Everett met 374th, his thoughts wandering, vaguely curious about where they were being sent, when a man stepped out of an alley only a few meters in front of him, a well-dressed stranger wearing a wide smile. He stood there, hands jammed into the pockets of an expensive trench coat, apparently waiting for Carlos to reach him. Carlos kept his expression carefully, neutral, studying the man warily. Tall, thin, dark hair, and eyes, but definitely Caucasian, early to mid-40s, and grinning as though he meant to share an exceptionally funny joke. Carlos prepared to walk past him, reminding himself of how many crazies lived in any decent-sized city, an unavoidable hazard of urban life. He probably wants to tell me about the aliens monitoring his brainwaves, maybe babble some conspiracy theory. "Carlos Oliveira?" the man asked, but it was more of a statement than a question. Carlos stopped in his tracks, his whole body tensing, instinctively letting his right hand drop to where he wore a gun, except he wasn't carrying. Hasn't since crossing the border. Carajo. As if sensing the upset he'd caused, the stranger took a step back. Holding his hands up in the air, he seemed amused, but not especially threatening. "Who's asking?" Carlos snapped. "And how the hell do you know my name?" "My name is Trent, Mr. Oliveira," he said, his dark gaze glittering with barely suppressed mirth, "and I have some information for you." Chapter 1. In the dream, Jill didn't run fast enough. It was the same dream she'd suffered every few days since the mission that had nearly killed them all that terrible, endless night in July. Back when only a few Raccoon citizens had been hurt by Umbrella's secret and the S.T.A.R.S administration wasn't completely corrupt. Back when she was still stupid enough to think that people would believe their story. In the dream, she and the other survivors, Chris, Barry, and Rebecca, waited anxiously for rescue at the hidden laboratory's helipad, all of them exhausted, wounded, and very aware that the buildings around and beneath them were about to self-destruct. It was dawn, cool light coming in shafts through the trees that surrounded the Spencer estate, the stillness broken only by the welcome sound of the approaching copter. 6 members of the Special Tactics and Rescue Service were dead, lost to the human and inhuman creatures that roamed the estate. And if Brad didn't set down quick, there wouldn't be any survivors. The lab was going to blow, destroying the proof of Umbrella's T-virus spill and killing them all. Chris and Barry waved their arms, motioning for Brad to hurry. Jill checked her watch, dazed, her mind still trying to grasp all that had happened, to sort it all out. Umbrella Pharmaceutical, the single biggest contributor to Raccoon City's prosperity and a major force in the corporate world, had secretly created monsters in the name of bioweapons research, and in playing with fire had managed to burn themselves very badly. That didn't matter now. All that mattered was getting the hell away. "And we've got maybe 3 minutes, 4 max. Crash!" Jill whirled around, saw chunks of concrete and tar fly into the air and rain down over the northwest corner of the landing pad. A giant claw stretched up from the hole, fell across the jagged lip, and the pale, hulking monster, the one she and Barry had tried to kill in the lab, the tyrant, leaped out onto the heliport. It rose smoothly from its agile crouch and started toward them. It was an abomination, at least 8 feet tall, Once human, perhaps, but no more. Its right hand, normal. Its left, a massive, chitinous grasp of claws. Its face had been horribly altered, its lips cut away so that it seemed to grin at them through sliced red tissue. Its naked body was sexless, the thick, bloody tumor that was its heart shuddering wetly outside of its chest. Chris targeted the pulsing muscle with his Beretta and fired, 5 9mm rounds tearing into its ghastly flesh. The tyrant didn't even slow down. Barry screamed for them to scatter, and then they were running. Jill pulling Rebecca away, the thunder of Barry's 357 crashing behind them. Overhead the copter circled, and Jill could feel the seconds ticking away, almost believed she could feel the explosion building beneath their feet. She and Rebecca pulled their weapons and started firing. Jill continued to pull the trigger even as she watched the creature knock Barry to the ground, slamming in a new clip as it went after Chris, firing and screaming, enveloped by a rising terror. Why won't it go down? From above, a shout and something thrown out of the copter. Chris ran for it, and Jill saw nothing else, nothing but the tyrant as it turned its attention to her and Rebecca. Indifferent to the firepower that continued plugging bloody holes through its strange body, Jill turned and ran, saw the girl do the same, and knew that the monster was after her. The face of Jill Valentine embedded in its lizard brain. Jill ran, and suddenly there was no heliport, no crumbling mansion, only a million trees and the sounds, her boots slapping the earth, the pulse of blood in her ears, her ragged breath. The monster was silent behind her, a mute, a terrible force, relentless as it's inevitable as death. They were dead. Chris and Barry, Rebecca, even Brad, she knew it. Everyone but her. And as she ran, she saw the tyrant's shadow stretch out in front of her, burying her own, and the hiss of its monstrous talons slicing down, melting through her body, killing her. No. No! No! Jill opened her eyes, the words still on her lips, the only sound in the stillness of her room. It wasn't the scream she imagined, but the weak, strangled cry of a woman doomed, caught in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Which I am. None of us were fast enough, after all. She lay still for a moment, breathing deeply, moving her hand away from the loaded Beretta under her pillow. It had become a reflex, and one she wasn't sorry to have developed. Useless against nightmares, though, she muttered and sat up. She'd been talking to herself for days now. Sometimes she thought it was the only thing that kept her sane. Gray light crept in through the blinds, casting the small bedroom in shadow. The digital clock on the nightstand was still working. She supposed she should be glad that the power was still on. But it was later than she hoped. Nearly 3 in the afternoon. She'd slept for almost 6 hours, the most she'd managed to get in the last 3 days. Considering what was going on outside, she couldn't help a flush of guilt. She should be out there. She should be doing more to save those who could still be saved. Knock it off, you better. You know better. You can't help anyone if you collapse, and those people you helped. She wouldn't think about it, not yet. When she'd finally made it back to the suburbs this morning, after nearly 48 sleepless hours of helping, she'd been on the verge of a breakdown. Forced to face the reality of what had happened to Raccoon, the city was irretrievably lost to the T-virus, or some variant of it. Like the researchers at the mansion, like the tyrant, Jill closed her eyes, thinking about the reoccurring dream, about what it meant. It matched the real chain of events perfectly, except for the end. Brad Vickers, the S.T.A.R.S alpha pilot, had thrown something out of the copter, a grenade launcher, and Chris had blown up the tyrant as it was going after her. They'd all gotten away in time, but in a way that didn't matter. For all the good they'd been able to accomplish since then, they might as well have died. It's not our fault. Jill thought angrily, aware that she wanted to believe that more than anything. No one would listen. Not the Home Office. not Chief Irons, not the press. If they'd listened, if they believed. Strange that all of it had happened only 6 weeks ago. It felt like years. The city officials and the local papers had enjoyed a field day with the S.T.A.R.'s reputation. 6 dead. The rest babbling fantastic stories about a secret laboratory, about monsters and zombies and an umbrella conspiracy. They had been suspended and ridiculed, but worst of all, nothing had been done to prevent the spread of the virus. She and the others had only been able to hope that the destruction of the spill site had put an end to the immediate danger. In the weeks following, so much had happened, they uncovered the truth about the S.T.A.R.S. That umbrella, technically White Umbrella, the division in charge of bioweapons research, was either bribing or blackmailing key members nationally in order to continue their research unimpeded. They learned that several of Raccoon City's council members were on the Umbrella payroll, and that Umbrella probably had more than one research facility experimenting with man-made diseases. Their search for information about Trent, the stranger who contacted her before the disastrous mission, as a friend to the S.T.A.R.S, had turned up nothing, but they'd come up with some extremely interesting background stuff on Chief Irons. It seemed that the chief had been in hot water at one point about a possible rape, and that Umbrella knew about it, and had helped him get his position anyway. Perhaps most difficult of all, their team had been forced to split up, to make hard decisions about what needed to be done and about their own responsibilities to the truth. Jill smiled faintly. The one thing she could feel good about in all of this was that at least her friends had made it out. Rebecca Chambers had joined up with another small group of S.T.A.R.S, descendants who were checking out rumors of other Umbrella laboratories. Brad Vickers, true to his cowardly nature, had skipped town to avoid Umbrella's wrath. Chris Redfield was already in Europe, scoping out the company's headquarters and waiting for Barry Burton and Rebecca's team to join him. And for Jill, who was going to wrap up her investigation of Umbrella's local offices before hooking up with the others. Except 5 days ago, something terrible had happened in Raccoon. It was still happening, unfolding like some poisonous flower, and the only hope now was to wait for someone outside to take notice. When the first few cases had been reported, no one had connected them with the S.T.A.R.S stories about the Spencer estate. Several people had been attacked in the late spring and early summer, surely the work of some deranged killer. After all, the RPD would catch him in no time. It wasn't until the Raccoon Police Department had put up roadblocks on Umbrella orders 3 days earlier that people had started paying attention. Jill didn't know they were managing to keep people out of the city, but they were. Nothing shipped in, no mail service, and the outside lines were cut. Citizens trying to leave town were turned back, told nothing about why. It all seemed so surreal now. Those first few hours after Jill had found out about the attacks, about the blockades. She'd gone to the RPD building to see Chief Irons, but he had refused to talk to her. Jill had known that some of the cops would listen, that not everyone was as blind or corrupt as Irons. But even with the bizarre nature of the assaults they witnessed, they hadn't been ready to accept the truth. And who could blame them? Listen up, officers. Umbrella, the company that's responsible for building up our fair city, has been experimenting with a designer virus in their own backyard. They've been breeding and growing unnatural creatures in secret laboratories, then injecting them with something that makes them incredibly strong and extremely violent. When humans are exposed to this stuff, they become zombies, for lack of a better term. Flesh-eating, mindless, decaying on the hoof zombies, who feel no pain and try to eat other people. They're not really dead, but they're pretty close. So let's work together, okay? Let's go out there and start mowing down unarmed citizens in the streets, your friends and neighbors, because if we don't, you could be next. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Jill sighed. She'd been a little more tactful, but no matter how well worded, it was still an insane story. Of course they hadn't believed her, not then, not in the light of day, and in the safety of their uniforms. It hadn't been until after dark, when the screaming had begun, that had been the 25th of September, and today was the 28th, and the police were almost certainly all dead. She last heard gunshots yesterday? Last night? It could have been the rioters, she supposed, but it didn't matter anymore. Raccoon was dead, except for the brain-dead virus carriers that roamed the streets, looking for a meal. Between no sleep and a near constant pump of adrenaline, the days had blurred together for her. After the police force had been destroyed, Jill had spent her time looking for survivors, endless hours ducking down alleys, knocking on doors, combing buildings for those who managed to hide. She found dozens, and with some help from a few of them, she made it to a safe place, a high school that had barricaded. Jill had made sure that they were secure before going back out into the city, searching for others. She'd found no one, and this morning when she'd gone back to the high school, she didn't want to think about it, but some part of her knew that she had to, that she couldn't afford to forget. This morning she'd gone back and the barricade had been gone, torn down by zombies or perhaps taken down by someone inside. Someone who looked out and thought that they saw a brother or uncle or daughter in the crowd of flesh eaters. Someone who thought that they were saving the life of a loved one, not realizing that it was too late. It had been a slaughterhouse, the air fetid with the stink of shit and vomit, the walls decorated with great smears of blood. Jill had nearly given up, then more tired than she'd ever been, unable to see anything but the bodies of those who'd been lucky enough to die before the virus could amplify in their system. As she walked through the almost empty halls, killing the handful of carriers that had still been stumbling around, people she'd found. People who had cried with relief when they'd seen her only hours before. Whatever hope she'd held on to was gone, lost with the realization that everything she'd been through was worthless. Knowing the truth about Umbrella hadn't saved anyone, and the citizens she thought she'd led to safety. Over 70 men, women, and children were gone. She couldn't really remember how she made it home. She hadn't been able to think straight and had barely been able to see through eyes swollen from crying. Outside of how it affected her, thousands had died. It was a tragedy so vast it was nearly incomprehensible. It could have been prevented, and it was Umbrella's fault. Jill pulled the Beretta out from under her pillow, allowing herself to feel for the first time the immensity of what Umbrella had done. For the last few days she kept her emotions in check. There had been people to lead, to help, and there had been no place for any personal feelings. Now, though, she was ready to get out of Raccoon and make the bastards who'd let this happen know how she felt. They had stolen her hope, but they couldn't stop her from surviving. Jill chambered around and set her jaw, the stirrings of true hatred in her gut. It was time to leave.